On Thanksgiving, my parents called me ungrateful in front of everyone. They laughed as if my whole life was a punchline. They didn't know I'd been carrying years of erased memories, stolen chances, and a silence so heavy it nearly broke me. That night I stood up, smiled, and raised my glass. A toast to the last time you'll ever see me. The room froze. Forks stopped. Eyes widened. And I walked out, leaving their perfect little world shattered in my wake. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love hearing how far my story can reach. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now let me tell you everything. If this story touches you, please subscribe to the channel. Every voice, every listener matters more than you know. My name is Evan Walker, and this is the story of how I walked away from a family that tried to erase me. I walked into the Harrington estate about 45 minutes late, not because of traffic, not because I lost track of time, but because I wanted to. I thought if I slipped in after the wine had dulled their sharpness and the turkey weighed them down, maybe I could disappear into the background. Maybe I wouldn't have to play my role in the carefully staged production they called family. The moment I crossed the threshold, though, I knew I had miscalculated. Conversations faltered just long enough for me to feel the shift in the air. Eyes flicked toward me and away again. Smiles stretched across faces but never reached their eyes. Gloria was the first to break through the tension. She swept across the polished hardwood heels, clicking like a metronome of control. Her perfume hit me before she did, expensive and suffocating. She opened her arms too wide, her voice pitched too sweet. Evan, we were just talking about you. A lie so polished it might as well have been rehearsed. I let her hug me, nothing more than a tap of the shoulders before she pulled away with that frozen smile. I scanned the room. Every wall was a shrine to Brandon. His graduation portraits, his ribbon-cutting ceremonies, his first article in a business journal framed in glass. His smile, his triumphs, his image immortalized from every angle. Mine gone erased so thoroughly. It was as if I had never existed. I stood there feeling like a ghost in my father's house, surrounded by proof that only one son had ever mattered. Dinner unfolded in its rigid choreography. Silverware clinked in unison, polite laughter timed to perfection. Then Gloria rose with her wine glass, the signal for her well-practiced toast. Her voice rang sharp and clear across the table. I just want to thank everyone who has made this year so special, and even the ungrateful ones. A ripple of laughter broke out, and I felt every eye, whether openly or in secret, land on me. My ears burned, but I kept my face still, my jaw tight. I had long since learned that flinching only gave them satisfaction. And then came the final cut. The lights dimmed, the projector hummed, and a video tribute began. 60 years of the Harrington family. Images flickered across the screen. Patrick in uniform, Gloria in evening gowns, Brandon scoring goals on the soccer field, Tessa smiling at her wedding, vacation shots, Christmas mornings, milestone after milestone. My absence wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate. Not one photo of me, not even a fleeting acknowledgement. Except for a single blurred frame, me standing half-hidden in the back of a barbecue group shot a decorative extra in a story I was supposed to belong to. Something inside me went very still. I rose slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. Faces turned, waiting, amused, curious. I smiled, cold, deliberate, and lifted my glass. A toast, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. To the last time you'll ever see me. The room froze. Forks hovered mid-air. Someone coughed, then stopped. Gloria's smile cracked. Brandon raised his eyebrows, more entertained than alarmed. Patrick didn't move. For the first time in my life, I had the room's full attention. I set my glass down, carefully turned, and walked away. Behind me, The perfect little play crumbled into a silence so thick it felt like smoke. That was the night everything shifted. That was the night I stopped being part of their script. Back in my apartment in Midtown Nashville, the silence was different. No clinking glasses, no staged laughter, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the muffled sounds of the city seeping through the windows. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, opened my laptop, and let the glow of the screen drag old ghosts back to the surface. The first memory hit me with the force of a punch. My law school graduation. I could still hear my name echoing through the auditorium as I walked across the stage. I looked out into the crowd, searching for them. Row after row of cheering families, waving signs, holding flowers, faces glowing with pride, and then my row empty. No father, no stepmother, no sister, no one. I kept telling myself maybe they were late, maybe traffic had trapped them, but by the time I sat back down with my diploma clutched in my hands, I knew. Hours later, Gloria texted me, "Sorry we couldn't miss Brandon's birthday dinner. It's once in a lifetime." The second memory came from a folder buried deep in my inbox, an email from the bank years ago, subject line account activity notification. My mother's college fund account, the one she had built from double shifts and worn-down hands, was empty, drained. The signature on the authorization, Patrick Harrington. I had called him, voice trembling, hands shaking. He didn't hesitate. Brandon had an opportunity. He needed a push. "You're smart, Evan. You'll figure it out." No apology. No shame. Just that same dismissive tone he used when I was a child bleeding from a scraped knee. And he told me to walk it off. I remembered the desperation of that year. 3 jobs, barely sleeping, stumbling into class half awake. My notebooks filled with smudged ink because my hands shook from exhaustion. Private loans stacked on top of each other like bricks pressing down on my chest. Every day a reminder that I had been robbed not just of money, but of the belief that someone had my back. Sitting there in my apartment, I realized something I hadn't let myself face before. This wasn't a single betrayal, not some isolated act of selfishness. It was a pattern, a design, a slow eraser graduation left behind. Money stolen, photos deleted. Every step they'd been rewriting the story so that I didn't exist. But I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining it. I had the emails, the bank statements, the scraps of proof I had clung to, not for revenge, but to remind myself that it was real, that I wasn't inventing the cruelty. For years, those files sat untouched in hidden folders. Now, staring at the screen, I saw them differently, not as proof of my pain, as weapons. The scars they left me weren't invisible anymore. They were carved into records, signatures, documents. They thought erasing me made me powerless. What they didn't understand was that eraser leaves a paper trail, and paper doesn't lie. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I made myself a promise. I had spent years surviving their silence. Now it was my turn to break it. The drive from Nashville to Santa Rosa stretched for hours. Endless miles of desert and sky, the road shimmering under the sun. I kept the windows cracked just enough to breathe in the dry air, the smell of dust and sagebrush clinging to everything. My hands tightened on the wheel as I thought of what awaited me. Marion Blake, my mother's sister. The last person in this family who had ever looked at me without judgment. I hadn't seen her in years, not since my mother's funeral, when she'd gripped my hand in the church pew and whispered, "You're not alone." Her house stood at the edge of town, a small wooden structure worn by wind and time. When she opened the door, her eyes carried the weight of decades, calm, steady, but shadowed by something heavier than age. She didn't ask why I had come. She only said, "You're ready, aren't you?" Inside, the living room smelled of old paper, and cedar books lined every wall. Stacks of letters and photographs covered the tables. She disappeared into a back room and returned with a wooden box, the kind people keep tucked away for generations. She placed it in my lap. "Your mother wanted this to be safe. I kept it until you could handle what was inside. I lifted the lid. On top lay the original will, yellowed at the edges, but clear as day. My mother's handwriting and signature stared back at me. Every clause carefully written. The education fund was to be used exclusively for me. No exceptions, no transfer, no reinterpretation. My throat tightened as I traced the words with my finger. It wasn't just money. It was proof of her faith in me. Faith they had stolen and redirected. Marion Blake wasn't finished. She spread out receipts and bank slips across the table. Transfer records, account numbers, dates. All of it pointed to one place Brandon's startup launched in the very month the account was emptied. She spoke softly, almost apologetically. I knew one day this would come back. It wasn't an accident, Evan. It was deliberate. I stared at the papers, but she reached again into her folder, producing another set of documents. This time it was an old HR complaint from the first firm I'd worked for out of law school. I remembered the humiliation of it, an idea I'd pitched suddenly appearing in the hands of a rival company. At the time, I doubted myself, thought maybe I'd imagined leaving files open. But Marion had something I never had: technical logs showing remote access into my personal computer during the very weekend Brandon had offered to help set up my Wi-Fi. My chest felt hollow. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It had been aimed at destroying the very career I had fought for. Piece by piece, it all locked into place. Graduation, abandoned funds, stolen ideas, sabotaged. This wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern drawn with intent. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice breaking. Marion didn't flinch. "Because you weren't ready. You were still clinging to hope that they might see you. If I had told you then, it would have crushed you. Now you're strong enough to face it." I sat in silence, staring at the papers spread before me. Proof layered over proof, each sheet heavier than the last. It wasn't anger that filled me, not even sadness. It was clarity, sharp and cold. The story I'd lived with for years of being forgotten, of bad luck, of mistakes, wasn't the truth. The truth was here in ink and signatures, and truth was something I could use. I closed the box gently, looked at my aunt, and nodded. I think I finally am ready. The morning back in Nashville was gray, the kind of light that makes the city feel washed out and tired. I sat at my kitchen table, the box from Marion still unopened beside me when the knock came. A courier handed me a thick envelope sealed with the emblem of a law firm I knew all too well, the one Gloria favored for all her business dealings. I tore it open and unfolded the first page. The language was pristine, dripping with courtesy. "In the spirit of maintaining family harmony, we extend the opportunity for you to voluntarily withdraw from the estate and trust planning process." Words like goodwill, understanding, mutual respect scattered across the page like confetti meant to disguise the blade hidden underneath. I read every line and felt the weight of what it meant. They weren't asking. They were cutting me out, but they wanted me to sign it myself so they could call it choice. I spread the documents across the table, each clause tightened like a noose: voluntary withdrawal, demonstration of maturity, preservation of family unity, dressed-up phrases masking the truth. They wanted my name erased legally and forever so that Brandon's path would be spotless. I poured myself a glass of wine, though it was barely noon. The burn steadied my hand as I stared at the papers. Memories of my mother flooded back, her hands raw from working extra shifts, the way she'd smile when she whispered, "One day this will help you build the life you deserve." That fund was supposed to be my safety net, my mother's last gift. And now it was gone, transformed into capital for Brandon's empire. And still they demanded more. They wanted my silence signed and sealed. I picked up the pen. For a long moment, I hovered, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Finally, I signed my name. But before I folded the pages, I leaned down and wrote beneath the printed lines in my own hand. I don't want a cent from people who never wanted me, but I will keep the truth. I let the ink dry, folded the contract, and sealed it back in the envelope. When I set it down on the counter, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't surrender. This was positioning. They would believe they'd won, that I had accepted exile in exchange for peace. But what I had accepted was different. I had accepted the loss of money, yes, but not of truth. I stood at the window, the city stretching out in muted tones beneath the gray sky. They thought I was leaving the game. In reality, I was changing the rules. They were preparing for silence. But what I was preparing was noise, sharp, undeniable, impossible to bury. As I watched the traffic pulse below, I whispered to myself, "This isn't over. This is just the beginning." That night I sat at my desk with the documents spread out before me, each page a fragment of the story they had tried to bury. The original will, my mother's words preserved in ink stating clearly that the fund was for me alone. The bank statements that mapped out every transfer showing how the money had slipped from her sacrifice into Brandon's company account. A timeline of his startup's launch perfectly aligned with the disappearance of my future and the gala guest list glossy and polished where my name was nowhere to be found. I stared at them until the words blurred, then opened my laptop. My fingers hovered above the keys before I typed a subject line as simple as it was devastating. I think you should all see this. No accusations, no explanations, no plea for validation. Just 4 attachments dropped into their inboxes like grenades. Silence I knew would weigh more heavily than any speech I could craft. I hit send. The sound of the email swooshing away felt final, like something had left me for good. For a few minutes, the apartment was still. Then my phone lit up, buzzing relentlessly. Messages poured in, cousins, distant relatives, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. Is this real? Why didn't you tell us sooner? Another voice. I always suspected. Now I know. I shut the phone off and left it face down on the table. My chest tightened as I sat in the dark, listening to the thud of my own heartbeat. Relief and dread mingled together, indistinguishable. I had lit the match. Now I had to watch it burn. By morning, the counterstrike arrived. Brandon had wasted no time. He was calling around using his polished charm, painting me as unstable. He said I was unraveling, that my accusations were fantasies spun from bitterness. A colleague from my early years at the firm called to warn me. "He's saying you've had a breakdown," he whispered. "He's shopping that story to anyone who will listen." I laughed, the sound bitter and empty. When they can't bury the truth, they bury the person who speaks it. That evening, the phone rang again. Marion's voice was urgent. "Evan, there's something else. I didn't give it to you before, but now you'll need it." Minutes later, an email from her appeared. Attached was a scan of system logs from my old laptop files I had long forgotten. It showed remote access sessions timed perfectly to a holiday weekend years ago when Brandon had insisted on helping me set up my Wi-Fi. That was the same week the project I'd poured myself into mysteriously surfaced at another firm. I sat frozen, staring at the glowing lines of data. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't my imagination. He had stolen not just money, not just my place in the family, but the very ideas I had built my career on. Proof had been sitting in Marion's hands for years, waiting for the moment I was strong enough to face it. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. A strange clarity settling over me. The email I had sent had opened the first crack. Brandon's lies would be his shield, but now I had the blade. And once this cut deep, there would be no stitching the wound closed again. The invitation had gone out weeks before glossy cardstock embossed in gold. The Harrington Family Gala, Houston, Texas. Gloria's pride on full display. She had spent months orchestrating every detail. The flowers imported the menu, curated the guest list stacked with donors and dignitaries. It was meant to be their victory lap, the crowning jewel of their image. On the morning of the event, my phone buzzed with a message from Megan Ortiz. The journalist's words were simple. "The piece is scheduled for tonight. Bayou Tribune front page timed with the gala." I hesitated only a moment before replying, "Let it run. If the Harringtons wanted to play theater, then the truth would debut on their stage." That night I sat alone in my apartment in Nashville, the glow of my laptop casting pale light across the room. I streamed the gala online, the camera panning across the glittering ballroom. Chandeliers dripped light across gowns and tuxedos. Gloria stepped onto the stage in emerald silk, a queen surveying her court. Patrick sat front and center, his jaw set, his hand gripping the armrest like he could command the room into obedience. Then, as Gloria raised her glass to begin her speech, I saw it happen. Guests began shifting in their seats, glancing at their phones. The hum of conversation turned jagged. Notifications lit up across the room. The headline flashed on their screens. "The Harrington cover-up misused trust funds, stolen ideas, a family's eraser." The shift in the ballroom was instant. Whispers spread, eyes darted. People excused themselves quietly but decisively. A major donor rose from his chair, face pale, and slipped out with his wife. Another couple left their champagne glasses half full on the table, walking out without a word. Gloria's smile faltered, her voice cracking as she tried to continue. Patrick pushed himself up, snatched the microphone. "These are lies," he barked. "Fabrications. We will address them appropriately." But his voice lacked the thunder it once carried. His hands trembled, his authority leaking out with every syllable, and Brandon nowhere to be seen. The camera cut to the side of the stage, the empty space where he was meant to appear. He had slipped away, leaving his parents to defend the empire he had built on theft. My phone buzzed. A message from Tessa. "You've ruined everything. Are you proud?" I stared at the words for a long moment before typing back, "No, they ruined themselves." I just turned on the light. I leaned back in my chair, the sound of my own breathing filling the silence. Watching from miles away, I felt no triumph, no glee, only inevitability. This was never about destroying them. It was about exposing what they had already done to themselves. In that glittering Houston ballroom beneath the chandeliers and the staged smiles, the Harrington mask had cracked. And once a mask cracks in public, no amount of polish can hide the fracture. I closed the stream, the last image lingering in my mind. Gloria's eyes darting across the crowd, searching for control and finding none. Patrick's voice shaking. Empty seats where loyal supporters had been minutes before, and Brandon vanished into the shadows. This was not the end. It was only the collapse of the stage they had built. The real reckoning was still ahead. The steps of the Davidson County Courthouse felt heavier than I remembered. The limestone walls, sun-bleached and solemn, towered above me like they had been waiting all these years for me to finally arrive with the weight I carried in my hands. Daniel Price walked beside me, his briefcase swinging lightly, but the bundle of documents I clutched was anything but light. Each page was years of betrayal distilled into evidence. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and paper. We didn't linger. Daniel Price guided me to the clerk's desk, where the hum of bureaucratic routine was oblivious to the storm about to break. I laid the folder down, my hand firm as I pushed it forward. The filing included everything: misuse of trust fund signatures, forged or used without consent, breaches of fiduciary duty so blatant they practically glared from the page. My mother's will bank records, transfer slips, logs of digital theft, every piece tied together into a timeline so damning it didn't need my voice to explain it. The clerk stamped the forms, slid copies back to us, and in that simple act, the story left the confines of family and became part of public record. Anyone with a Wi-Fi connection could pull it up. No more whispers behind closed doors. No more hidden deletions. The truth had stepped into daylight. I walked out of the courthouse and onto the wide stone steps, the Nashville sun spilling over me. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the burden alone. It belonged to the world now. I drew a deep breath, the kind that clears space inside your chest, and let it out slowly. The air felt different, sharper, freer. That afternoon, back in my apartment, an email appeared from Patrick. No greeting, no wasted words. From this moment on, you are no longer part of this family. I read it twice, letting the words settle. He thought he was cutting me off, declaring my exile. But sitting there in my quiet apartment, I realized something he never would. I had cut them off long before. What he thought was punishment was only acknowledgement of what had already been true for years. I closed the laptop, walked to the window, and looked down at the river of headlights weaving through Nashville streets. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel triumph. I felt stillness. It was the kind of calm that comes before the final confrontation, when all the noise falls away and only clarity remains. That night, I poured a glass of water, stood by the window, and whispered to myself, "It's almost over." When the courthouse filings spread through the press and legal blogs, Brandon panicked. I could see it in the sheer chaos of his reaction. He didn't defend himself with facts. Instead, he reached for the same weapon my family had always used: character assassination. He called reporters, whispering poison into their ears. He drafted emails, carefully worded, but laced with venom. Evan Harrington has a history of instability. He was subject to complaints in his early career. This is just his bitterness speaking. He was building a narrative, trying to paint me as broken, unreliable, unfit to be believed. Megan Ortiz, the journalist who had already helped surface my family's corruption, called me one evening. Her voice was calm, but edged with urgency. "He's trying to turn the tide. He's saying, 'You made all this up that you've been unraveling for years. Do you have anything that slams the door shut?'" I hesitated only briefly before dialing Marion. She answered on the second ring, her tone steady, almost like she had expected this moment. "Evan, I've been keeping something. It's time." Moments later, my inbox lit up with a file and affidavit notarized, drawn directly from the HR department at my first law firm. It stated clearly that evidence of a breach had been traced back to remote access initiated from Brandon's credentials on a weekend he had been in my apartment. My breath caught as I read the lines. It wasn't just speculation anymore. It was binding testimony, a document that tied him to the theft of my intellectual property. The very theft that had almost derailed my career before it even began. I forwarded it to Megan with nothing more than 2 words. "Use this." The next morning, the headline dominated the business section. "Corporate theft confirmed. Evidence shows Harrington Arrow stole intellectual property, family complicit in cover-up." The effect was immediate and brutal. Brandon's company stock plummeted within hours. Investors fled. Clients canceled contracts overnight. His smiling face, once plastered across magazines and websites, vanished as the firm scrubbed him from their pages. Patrick wasn't spared. The Veterans Organization, where he had held a seat of honor, suspended him indefinitely pending review. His name was quietly removed from brochures and plaques. Gloria, too, faltered. Her carefully built charity circuit evaporated, events canceled under the guise of postponement but never rescheduled. Late that evening, my phone rang. It was Tessa. Her voice cracked through the line. "I never thought it would go this far," she whispered. "I didn't think it could. It already went this far a long time ago." I told her, "You're only seeing it now because you can't look away anymore." She didn't reply. The line went quiet, and then she hung up. Hours later, as the city lights flickered against my apartment walls, I played a voicemail from Gloria. Her voice dripped with venom, every syllable trembling with rage. "We've lost everything because of you. I hope you're proud." I listened halfway, then deleted it. The sound no longer had power. It was just noise from a woman who had built her empire on lies. I stood by the window watching Nashville glow against the night sky. They had built themselves on wealth, on reputation, on carefully curated stories. And in weeks it had collapsed, not because I destroyed it, but because truth finally caught up. This was the summit, the point of no return. All their years of control, all their power had drained away, and what remained was only what had always been there, a hollow core. For the first time I felt taller than the weight they had kept on my shoulders. Their downfall wasn't my triumph. It was simply the inevitable reckoning. And I knew, standing there in the stillness, that I hadn't just survived their eraser. I had erased their illusion. Even after the scandal about Brandon's theft had spread through every corner of the media, I knew the Harringtons weren't finished. Patrick still had allies, old war buddies, business connections, political donors who owed him favors. They could still lean on editors, call in debts, twist the story into silence if I let it remain fragmented. The truth had to be undeniable, packaged so cleanly and transparently that no one could mistake it for rumor. I met Daniel Price at his office, a quiet corner room with blinds half drawn against the Nashville sun. We cleared the table and laid everything out. My mother's original will, her signature looped in blue ink. The bank statements stamped with transfer dates that lined up perfectly with Brandon's launch. The computer logs Marion had kept exposing remote access at the exact moment my work disappeared. And the notarized affidavit. Marion had secured her written testimony backing every fact. Daniel Price leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes on me. "We have enough to take them apart in court. Civil and criminal we can win." He tapped a finger on the will. But the real question, Evan, is what do you want? Do you want damages? Do you want them punished? Or do you want something else? I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the pile of papers that had once been fragments of my nightmares. "I don't want their money," I said finally. "I don't want their apologies. I want the truth to stop belonging to me alone. I want it to belong to everyone." That night in the quiet of my apartment, I called Megan Ortiz. Her voice was steady, expectant. I scanned the entire archive, hundreds of pages, and sent them to her in careful order. Will bank records, receipts, logs, affidavit timelines. Nothing left out. Nothing softened. By the time the files finished uploading, I felt lighter, as if I had placed years of weight into hands that could finally carry it into daylight. 4 days later, the Bayou Tribune released the exposé. It wasn't a short article or a gossip piece. It was a 42-page investigation anchored by scans of original documents. The headline was stark and merciless. The Harrington cover-up. A family's decades of erasure and betrayal. The ripple was immediate. Lawyers who had once defended the family issued quiet statements of withdrawal. Charities canceled their partnerships. Former allies distanced themselves publicly. For the first time, the Harrington name was not currency, but liability. That evening, an email appeared in my inbox from Patrick. 6 words, nothing more. "You have betrayed us, my son." I stared at the line until the letters blurred, then laughed softly in the silence of my apartment. "No, I thought the betrayal was years ago when you signed my future away, when you scrubbed my face from your walls. Tonight wasn't betrayal. Tonight was recognition." I closed the laptop, picked up my journal, and wrote in long, deliberate strokes, "I don't need to win. I only needed the truth to be seen." And now it has been. A week later, I set a simple table in my apartment. Nothing fancy, just roast chicken garlic bread and a bottle of red wine. Around me sat Daniel Price, steady as always. Megan Ortiz, with her sharp wit and sharp eyes. Marion Blake, whose quiet presence felt like the last thread connecting me to my mother, and 2 young colleagues from the firm, eager but respectful. Their laughter cautious at first and then warm. There were no engraved name cards, no staged videos, no gilded centerpieces, just food passed around, plates, clinking stories exchanged. For the first time in my life, I looked around a table and thought, this is family. Not by blood, not by duty, but by choice and truth. After the dishes were cleared and the night wound down, I drove across town to Maplewood Cemetery. The streets were quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost sacred. I parked, walked through rows of stones until I found hers. My mother's name etched in gray granite, softened by time, but steady. I pulled a folded envelope from my coat pocket. Inside was the letter I had written days before. I kept your name clean. I am no longer in their house under their thumb. I am free now. I laid it at the base of her stone, weighed it down with a small rock, and stood there as the wind rustled the oak leaves overhead. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. For the first time since I was a child, I breathed without weight pressing down on my chest. Back in my apartment, the voicemail light blinked red. I pressed play and heard Gloria's voice sharp with bitterness. We've lost everything because of you. I hope you're proud. Halfway through, I deleted it. The venom no longer reached me. It was only an echo from a world I no longer lived in. I sat on the couch, the lights of Nashville flickering through the window, and let the stillness settle. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. I whispered into the quiet, not for anyone else, but for myself. They called me ungrateful, but I am grateful. Grateful I finally walked away. And that was the truth. The ending wasn't their ruin, though ruin had found them. The ending was my release. Peace hadn't come from reconciliation or apology. It came from leaving, from stepping out of the shadow of a name that had never held me with love. I chose my family at that table. I chose my freedom at that grave. And I chose myself in the silence that followed. Sometimes peace doesn't mean going back. Sometimes it means never going back again. And in that knowledge, I found the kind of freedom no inheritance could ever buy. When I look back on everything, I realized the greatest weight I carried was never the money, the erased photos, or the betrayal written in contracts and forged signatures. The heaviest weight was silence. I was told to swallow it, to accept my role as invisible, to smile, while the narrative was rewritten without me. But silence doesn't heal. It festers. It becomes a cage that convinces you there's no way out. The night I stood up and raised my glass at that Thanksgiving table, I didn't just walk away from a family. I walked away from silence itself. It took years for me to see that letting go is not defeat. I had always thought leaving meant losing, that stepping aside meant surrender. But what I learned is that staying in the wrong place with the wrong people is what truly breaks you. Sometimes you have to give up what was never yours to claim the life that always should have been. The truth I carried wasn't revenge. It was restoration. It was giving myself back the dignity that had been chipped away year after year. And now I can breathe. The peace I feel is not about their downfall. It's about my freedom. They called me ungrateful, but I've never been more grateful in my life. Grateful for the courage to finally say no. Grateful for the chance to rewrite my own story. Grateful for the few voices who stood beside me when it mattered most. If my story resonates with you, if it stirs something inside you, I hope you'll stay with me. Leave a comment, even a simple hi, so I know you're listening. Share where you're from. I love to see how far these words can reach. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories like this, because every listener reminds me I'm not alone in speaking, and maybe it will remind you that you're not alone either. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving space to my story. And if you take anything from it, let it be. This peace is not something handed to you. It's something you choose, and you're allowed to choose it even if it means walking away.